certainly other, there was a rope walk, so there were people making the ropes, making the sails, provisioning the ships. It was really all about that. So.
Well, this is interesting, fascinating, and the pictures are really
They're quite
beautiful, aren't they?
Yes.
They have so much light and everything, and you can tell that Happy was really...
He really captured it, yes, he really studied it.
Much more so than a lot of other artists that I've seen.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, well, let's go on to the next section.
Okay. We'll get into the nitty-gritty of whaling.
Uh-oh.
Oh, boy.
You ready for Petroleum?
We good?
Mm-hmm.
So, this is a more intimate space than the gallery that we were in before. This was probably originally, when the house was built, an everyday dining room. Not the kind of formal dining room, but kind of everyday breakfast or eating space. This is where we display most of the artifacts that are very specifically related to the whaling industry. Some of them are more usual than like the harpoons, things you'd expect to see, the various instruments that were used either to catch the whale, to render it into pieces that can be boiled.
Zach, do these, do they
yeah,
have boards on them so that they can pull them back
yes,
in?
Well, you
to
can
get that
imagine.
close to the whale.
Yes, if you picture yourself, and there, I don't know if this is going to show up on the film because these two prints are under glass, but they would row up to a whale as silently as possible, so as not to kind of scare it, and get up as close to the whale as they could, and then the harpooner would throw the harpoon, and it would be attached to a rope, as this is, just a little short length of rope, because this is all of wrought iron. This early one of wrought iron is 18th century period, with these very pronounced barbs that jut back at an angle, because the idea is that if the harpoon is thrown hard enough, it will penetrate the skin of the whale, and then it won't release. But of course, you don't want to lose your harpoon. So, this is attached to a rope, and if it's the initial strike, of course, the whale is immediately alarmed, because you can imagine whales have very few natural predators. They're really the biggest guy in the ocean. And out of alarm and fear, it would tend to want to swim away. And so the rope enables you to hold on to the harpoon, even if you let the rope out.
Yes. And would just one harpoonist go for it?
Well, there would be one. Yeah, there were typically 5 men rowing. There was one man steering, and then the other man would go to the front, and he was the harpooner. So it's a crew of 7 on a whale boat. Oftentimes, there would be anywhere from 3 or 4 whale boats, basically oversized rowboats, on a whale ship.
Right.
And typically only one boat would be sent out in pursuit of the whale. So that initial strike would injure the whale, but it certainly wouldn't kill it. And then off they would go, and then if the whale tired, they would row up closer, do it again. And so through a series of these, it's a gruesome story.
Yeah.
But it was a period when people thought that that's what creatures were put on Earth for.
Right.
We
But that was
consume
basically
so.
the only way they had to have light.
It was the preferred form of light. There was a lot of experimentation with other forms of oil and candles, but whale oil burned the brightest and the cleanest. It was not smoky. It was just expensive.
Right.
So increasingly, as the 1800s progressed, the demand for it grew. The supply decreased. The price went up. All those market pressures. And it just got to the point where the scientific community needed to keep experimenting with other vegetable oils, animal oils, to find a replacement, because it was not sustainable. And that's why suddenly, with petroleum discovered in quantity, that made the difference. But long before that, we had this early type of harpoon. Later types, Americans are famous for tinkering with things. And always figuring out a kind of a quicker way to make something, or a more efficient way, or a better device. And so you'll see this later type, which is called a toggle type, actually is a more deadly form of harpoon, because it penetrates the skin much more quickly, and then there's a barb here which, when it locks in the skin, when it's pulled back, it presents a much wider surface to lock into the skin. So these are of 19th century period. Some of these are labeled with blacksmith's marks. Many of them were made here in Sag Harbor.
Now,
So
the
these are-
typical whale that would be on the New England, or basically our coastline
Yes.
here in New York,
Yeah.
what is the typical whale?
That is the now we call that the North Atlantic right whale.
Okay.
It's the right whale, and the population of them, it's an endangered species now, the population of the
Wonder
right
why.
whale. Yeah, well, that's just it. These large creatures swim up and down the coast, you know, from Labrador all the way to Florida, down in that area. And so they're very endangered because they're swimming through these sea lanes that are coming out of the big ports, Baltimore, etc. So they're kind of colliding there. And that's back in the 18th century, they were much more plentiful, and they swam closer to shore because they didn't have any understanding of any natural predators. So that's why they would occasionally drift up onto the beach. They were injured in some way. Or in any event, they swam close enough to shore. It was only by the early 1800s that species of whale became so rare that these large ships had to go further and further out to sea, down around the Horn, out to the Pacific, eventually up into the Arctic Ocean, where they found a whole other. So they're always in search of you know, plentiful whales somewhere. And what's interesting is that the captains of these ships, we have what's called log books. These are handwritten diaries, essentially, daily record books. And people might think that that's just something the captain kept to sort of pass the time or record the trip in some way. Actually, the purpose of that, those books were the possession of the whaling company when the captain returned. And if you were in this business for 20 or more years, you would assemble a collection of these logbooks which contained a wealth of information about which area in the world, at what time of year you could find the whales in most quantity, etc. So this was kind of a collective wisdom about
Do you have a
success.
sample of one
We
here?
do. We have several on display over here.
Look at this.
They're quite wonderful. We rotate these because we try to keep them out of the sunlight. They're leather-bound books. At times they'll have illustrations of ships drawn in, or the actual whales that they took, because there are many species of whales, and some were yielded better, you know, amount of oil, etc. So they're a wealth of information. They will also occasionally, you'll be reading one of these, and they'll discover an island that no one had ever heard of before. And then the question is, well, is it populated? If so, are they friendly? And so the experience of coming into contact, you know, with foreign people became quite an issue. One of the more interesting kinds of artifacts that we have are these very decorative ceremonial spears and these shields. These were brought back from the South Pacific as souvenirs in the 1830s and 40s. And so there you were as a whaler, you know, in some foreign place, and maybe you would trade something of value to acquire something like this to bring home.
Wow.
So very interesting ethnographic.
Yes, it is, isn't it? And what about this piece up here that looks so
that is
deadly?
well, that's actually made out of, those are shark's teeth.
Right.
They're all tied to that, piece of wood. Again, not a weapon, but rather probably a ceremonial piece of some sort. And we did an interesting exhibit several years ago on surfing, and the history of surfing, and the reason that we did that, and what's making me think of it, is the decorations that you see hand painted here. The whalers are credited, this would be, let's say in the pre-revolutionary 1760s or so, as being the first to observe people surfing in the South Pacific.
Wow.
Because these were water people who lived in and out of the water constantly. That was their environment. And so the whale ships were the first to actually come upon these islands with people entertaining themselves in this way. And these people were heavily tattooed. That was a kind of a local thing. And so the tattooing that they discovered, which was similar to the ornamentation on these shields, so that was also the origin of tattooing. That sort of that became very
Interesting.
fashionable to be tattooed.
Okay.
I suppose it still is, among certain people.
Among certain people.
Among certain people. So that was both the discovery of surfing as well as of tattooing. So, we have all sorts of things nautical. One of our more unusual pieces is this chair
Oh, wow.
that somebody crafted out of whale bones.
Oh,
Not a practical piece, just a whimsical folk, piece of folk art, basically worked up out of vertebrae and jawbones and whatnot. So, where else would you expect to find a chair made out of whale bones?
absolutely.
And at the Whaling Museum, right?
Very historical, it really is. Anything in this cabinet we should know about?
Well, yeah, the other thing, you realize there you are out on a ship for 2 or 3 years, and the captain is not only the captain of the ship, but he becomes the ship's doctor, and he's the ship's everything, basically. So we have interesting things here that point to that. One is a medicine kit here that would have been part of the captain's equipment. So if he wasn't able to fix you up, you were...
Oh, I see, so these
pretty-
little
all those-
containers would
all
hold different
those little
medicines.
tubes, yes, all those little
Aha.
tubes were medicines. Up on top we have a piece of hard tack, so called. It's that hard ship's biscuit, because of course food on long voyages would tend to spoil, and so they relied upon either salted meats or dried biscuits.
Right.
So we have all kinds of little curiosities. Over in this cabinet, we have a little bit of scrimshaw. Scrimshaw is that folk art in which you take either a tooth, these are the teeth from a sperm whale, typically the parts of the whale that really had no practical value, the teeth didn't have much of a market, so they were often divvied up among the whalers, and they would decorate them for kind of as a pastime. So we have some whale's teeth here.
Imagine the size of an animal that could have
Teeth that size.
Wow.
Well, what I didn't mention when we came in, and perhaps when we go back outside, when our visitors enter the Whaling Museum now, they walk through the jaw of
Right.
the jawbone
Right.
of a right whale, and it's
Huge.
colossally large.
Oh, okay, and
So here's our fabulous jawbone of a right whale. So visiting here, one can imagine being swallowed by the whale.
You've heard of
Doesn't hurt a bit.
Jonah, so...
Doesn't hurt a bit. Yeah, colossal jawbone. Quite wonderful.